Inshallah, Imam Khalid will be starting now. Imam Khalid has a flight at 6:45. He just got back, like we said, so he's going to, inshallah ta'ala, do one more session, inshallah ta'ala. So please do give him your full attention. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Okay, brothers and sisters, continuing on our journey through the life of one of the most dynamic and trailblazing and transformative figures in the last part of the 20th century, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X. We talked about how after Malcolm's mother had her nervous breakdown and his father had been killed, an insurance company claiming that it was because of his own suicide, but all of the facts pointed to something very different. That Malcolm, in his school career, was just completely turned around by this racist teacher that totally discouraged him from pursuing any kind of profession other than doing something with his hands. And so after a few months, when Malcolm was 14 years old, he actually moved to live with his sister, Ella Collins, who lived in Boston, Massachusetts. And Ella was what was called in American society his half-sister. She was a product of a union with Earl Little, and not Louise, Malcolm's mother, but with another woman. And Ella always took a liking. When you read the story and talk to the family members, they say that Ella always found something special about this mischievous, smart young man, Malcolm. And so Ella was quick to take Malcolm in. And Malcolm found that the area in which Ella lived, in the Roxbury section of Boston at that time, was just a little too tame for his liking. He wanted to experience the life, and some people say the low life, of Boston. He was not satisfied in this upper middle class neighborhood in which his sister was living in. So he wanted to get out and experience some things that his young, youthful nature was calling upon him to do. And then Malcolm lived with Ella until he was about, and the ages vary depending on who's telling the story, until he was about 17 or 18 years old, where he ended up moving briefly to Flint, Michigan, and then he moved to Harlem. He moved to a place of bright lights and fast living and fast cars and fast women and fast everything. And by the time Malcolm got to Harlem, he had this flaming, what you would call, conch. It was an attempt during the period, and the style was made popular by African American musicians, particularly jazz musicians. They would put what they call a process into their hair to turn their kind of woolly hair into more stringy hair to imitate the hair of white folks. And Malcolm's hair was naturally red. And so he had this conch up on top of his head, and it was a flaming red. It was like his hair was on fire when you see it, as bright as the hair was. And he started to dress and learned to dress in the style of Harlem at that time. And one of the styles was the style called a zoot suit. It was a large, and actually some of the suits we wear today remind me of zoot suits. I've seen a lot of people walking around, and except for the colors, they look like the zoot suits. They were very long coats, and oftentimes the colors were red and bright gold and yellow and really loud colors. And Malcolm started to dress in this manner to adapt his dress and his lifestyle to the environment that he chose in Harlem at this particular time. And so it was nothing but trouble for Malcolm as it relates to his social well-being, because he began to get involved in petty kinds of hustles. He began to get into petty kind of games with gambling, and he began to start to steer white customers who would come into Harlem at that time who wanted to try to find black females to have illicit temporary relationships with. He became a steerer. And when he knew that folks wanted to do this, Malcolm was somebody who could tell you, well, you give me a little money, I can point you to where you need to go. And so Malcolm's lifestyle became one, as he described it himself after he left himself and Allah elevated him from this. He talks about how far he had sunk into the mud of America that no one, he said, he felt, could have morally sunk to the level of depravity, as he described himself. And I think some of this description was actually over on a kind of exaggeration. Because when you really find out the things that he was doing, even though they were illegal and illicit and unethical, they didn't represent the kind of depravity that Malcolm later would describe to Alex Haley in his autobiography, and we'll get to that in a moment. But whether it was this stuck deep in the moral mud of New York City in America or whatever it was not a lifestyle that was conducive for someone trying to elevate themselves and their consciousness about who they were. Malcolm then moved back to Boston in 1946 to live with his sister, temporarily to live with Ella again in Boston. And Malcolm took some of the skills, the anti-social skills that he had learned while he was in New York, to go back to Boston to organize a little criminal gang. And they began to go and rob houses in the rich and exclusive areas of Boston, Massachusetts. And Malcolm made the mistake they had broken into a house and they had stolen a watch. And Malcolm wanted to keep that watch rather than try to fence it. He was attracted by the watch. And so he took it to a watch repair place to get it repaired. And when he went back to pick it up, he was arrested for grand larceny and theft because the watch had been reported missing. So Malcolm goes back to pick up his watch. It's not what you saw on the Spike Lee 1992 X movie where he was actually in the apartment trying to get another conch and the police ran in and on him. No, Malcolm was arrested when he was going to get his watch, what wasn't his watch, but the watch that had been stolen that he had put in for repair. And he was arrested at this point. And included in his gang were 2 white females. And Malcolm would later say that he got 8 to 10 years on this first offense, not because of the nature of his crime, but he was bold enough to involve white females in his criminal activities or even to have associations. So his first offense in which he was prosecuted for was an offense that would normally carry a much lighter sentence, but he got 8 to 10 years on his first time out. He and his friend, Malcolm Shorty Jarvis, were sentenced to the same thing and put into the same prison. I had mentioned that Malcolm was not a person who was illiterate when he went to prison, and I want to just give you an example of how literate he was. Malcolm was underdeveloped intellectually. Malcolm was underdeveloped in his academics, but he was by no means illiterate or slow or anything like this. When Malcolm was first tested in the Charleston State Prison in Massachusetts, he scored in his reading good, very good. He scored in math, that he had a high average in math, that his abstract reasoning and range of information was superior. his older sister Hilda, encouraged Malcolm that now that you've rekindled this brain inside of your head, why don't you start taking academic classes? So this is what he started to do. And some of the classes, and all this stuff is documented, some of the classes that he took plain English, he took elementary German, he took elementary Latin, and he got excellent scores in every academic course that he took upon entering the Charleston State Prison and any other prison that he was in for the next 8 years. We find also at Charleston State Prison there was this inmate by the name of John Bembry. And Bembry went by the name of Bimby. And Bimby was someone that did not involve himself in the nonsense that was going on in the prisons, and he was someone that encouraged Malcolm to start reading books that could be of value to you. Quit reading, as Malcolm described it himself, quit reading cowboy books. Quit reading books that have no value other than you're perhaps learning a few words. Read something that could enrich you and so that you can be a better person when you get out. After about a year and a half, Malcolm's family began to send him letters, particularly his brother Filbert, who was a member of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm's other siblings had also joined the nation. But Malcolm said that when his brother Filbert sent him a letter talking about this Elijah Muhammad and the true teachings for the Asiatic black man in the wilderness of North America, that he just immediately rejected it. He didn't want to hear what his brother Filbert was saying, so he just completely dismissed it. Because from a religious standpoint, in prison at this point, Malcolm was identified and called Satan. Not because he looked like some caricature of the devil, but because of his just iconoclastic, nothing was sacred to Malcolm. And he was calling himself an atheist at this time. So when his family members started to send him letters talking about this religion for the black man, Malcolm said he just dismissed it out of hand. I don't want to hear what Filbert has to say. He joins everything. He's been every kind of Christian, so now he's just found something else crazy to be a part of. But when his younger brother Reginald, who was Malcolm's crime protege before Malcolm was arrested, wrote him and said, Malcolm, you need to stop eating pork, and you need to stop smoking cigarettes, and I'll show you how to get out of prison. But this was something that actually caught Malcolm's attention. So when Reginald finally came to visit him, Malcolm was more receptive to these teachings that Reginald was saying, that this man by the name of Elijah Muhammad, who said that he was a prophet of God, who was commissioned by Allah, by God himself, to be the messenger to the black people in America. And included in the theology or the mythology of this particular organization was that white people were the actual creation of a big-headed scientist by the name of Yaku, who on the island of Paphos 44,000 years ago genetically engineered by by bringing light-skinned African Americans together until you keep doing it, until now you have white people. So they said that Yaqub, the big-head scientist, genetically engineered and created the white race, but this was a devil race. Now keep in mind that we're talking about a time when the group psychology of so many African American people, especially those in the ghettos around the United States, was one of low to no self-esteem. That the psychology of oppression had impacted these folks, our folks, so much that many from the African American community were receptive to the idea that no, you're not someone who is inferior to white folks, you are superior. As a matter of fact, Yaqub created them, and he was a black man. He was an evil scientist. And so Malcolm eventually, in a relatively short period of time, embraced this ideology of the Nation of Islam. And he even, as it was a practice of the organization, for every individual, man or woman, who wanted to join, to write a letter to Elijah Muhammad, who was claiming to have been the prophet of Allah, the prophet of God. Write this letter. And you do it perfectly. And I know personally people who were friends of mine, who were members of the Nation of Islam, who would send off their letters, and these were people who halfway were, I'm not going to say halfway, they were intelligent people. And these were folks who would send their letters off and have it sent back to them. Said, no, you didn't curve this right, or something was wrong with it. So it was a process of earning an X, earning acceptance, earning this right to replace your so-called slave name. Like my last name is Griggs, and I literally know where the plantation was in Southern Virginia, where my Griggs part of my name came from. I know the plantation, I know the ancestor who lived to be over 113 years old, who told my father all of these stories about the horrors of slavery and all of these things. And so when I embraced Islam through the Sunni channel, I did consider changing my last name, but because I knew who that ancestor was and he was a slave, I decided, well, that's okay. That was my condition. That was my family condition, and I kept the name. But this was not the case in the Nation of Islam at that time and for a lot of years to come. So Malcolm joined the Nation of Islam. Now Malcolm changed in the way he was presenting himself in the nation. I don't have the time to go through a lot of details, but Malcolm was released from prison in 1952. And he moved he moved to Detroit, Michigan to live with his brother Philbert. He was working in a furniture store. His brother got him a job working in a furniture store. But it was in a very short period of time when Elijah Muhammad realized that there was something special about this guy, Malcolm. And so he started to invite Malcolm to his home. And he realized that, yes, it wasn't just intuition, that this person, Malcolm, this guy, Malcolm X, has potential to build this Nation of Islam, because you see, even though the Nation of Islam started in 1930, at the time of Malcolm's release from prison in 1952, a liberal estimate of the number of people in the Nation of Islam at that time was less than 400 people across the nation. But Elijah Muhammad saw something in Malcolm, and he quickly appointed him as the assistant minister in Detroit. And then he sent Malcolm to Philadelphia to try to build it up. And in very short time, wherever Malcolm would go, there would be 100 at least people joining the Nation of Islam, just because of the charisma and the persistence and the organizational brilliance of Malcolm. The organization, from the time Malcolm was out in a very short period of time, developed from this small group of people to a very large organization. And Malcolm, and I'm going to speed through a lot of this history in the interest of time, and then the period that Malcolm was in the Nation of Islam, it was a period when the civil rights movement in this country, the modern day civil rights movement in the country in the 1950s, in the mid-1950s, that it was starting to capture the attention of the American public. The civil rights movement, for those of you who may not be as familiar with it, was primarily a Christian-based movement to try to win rights and equal access for African American people. They were trying to do things like be able to vote, to be able to sit in anywhere they wanted, in in public transportation, to be able to sit at lunch counters without someone coming and dumping salt or tomato ketchup or things on your head for sitting in a whites-only section. You may not understand, but during the 1950s, when Malcolm had come out of prison in 1952, throughout this decade of the 1950s, some of the worst expression of racist violence and segregation was going on, and it even intensified as the civil rights movement began to get stronger. Now this event, or these events of the civil rights movement, were events that Malcolm as a person and the Nation of Islam did not directly participate or involve themselves in. They sat on the sidelines. As a matter of fact, at that particular time, Malcolm was extremely critical of the tactics of the civil rights movement, and he was calling the ministers who were leading this movement Uncle Toms. He was calling them clowns. He was saying, how can you take your children and your women and put them in front of groups, of racist groups who are turning police dogs on your children and on your women? How could you do this? What kind of men do you call yourself to be? So even though Malcolm was not involved in the civil rights movement directly at this particular time, his impact was truly felt. Because there was this looming picture of this red-headed guy who didn't have a conch at this particular time, but there was this looming picture of someone who was articulating a social change vehicle that did not involve Christianity, nor did it involve nonviolence. And so Malcolm began to get the attention of the federal and state authorities before he garnered the attention of the people right there in New York, where he had become the minister of Temple No. 7 in Harlem in New York. And so what we find in 1957, let me give you this quick story about Malcolm. This is when Malcolm exploded onto the New York consciousness and even the national African American consciousness. That what happened was that the New York City police were doing their New York City police thing, and I'm sorry if anybody here from New York, don't take offense to what I'm saying about New York. But the New York City police were doing their thing, and they were beating this African American with their clubs, like Rodney King. And they were beating him very badly, and a young man by the name of Johnson Hinton was walking by with two other members of the Nation of Islam, and they said to him, hey, wait a minute, man. This ain't Alabama, this ain't Georgia, Mississippi, what are y'all doing? And so the policeman turned on Hinton and began to beat him with the clubs, and they beat him until he was unconscious. And he was taken to the police station rather than to the hospital and arrested and placed into a jail cell and a lawful island, but perhaps left there to die. So someone found Malcolm, who was the minister at this time, but his popularity was not what it was to become in Harlem. So they found Malcolm and said, you know, Minister Malcolm, this is what's going on. And so Malcolm went to the police station and demanded that he and a couple of the other members of the nation see Brother Hinton, and after they saw him, they demanded that he be taken to the hospital for treatment. And so what happened when he was taken to the hospital, and the word came back, and Malcolm was still, unlike the Spike Lee movie, but when the word came back that he's being treated, he's going to live, they think he's going to survive, by this time, Malcolm had put out the word for members of the Nation of Islam to bring all of the members of the nation that they could. And as all of these members were converging on this police precinct, members of the African American community converged with them, because the story was spreading about how this innocent guy was being beaten down by the police. And so the legend of Malcolm as a political figure in New York started with this particular incident, in my humble opinion. And that is when Malcolm heard that Hinton was going to be okay, the report is that he stepped outside and just motioned with his hand, something like that, to the members of the nation, and quietly, they said it was up to 4,000 people out there. And when those who were not members of the nation saw the fruit of Islam, members of the nation just walk away silently, the crowd just dispersed, and just with Malcolm's hand gesture, no comment, anything else. And what was true, from my understanding, a little research was, from the Spike Lee movie, that one of the ranking officers who saw Malcolm step out there and motion with his hand and everyone move, said that that's too much power for any one man to have. That one man should not be able to do some stuff like this and control this many angry black folks. And so Malcolm, at this point in 1957, really got the attention not only of the African American community, and caught the attention of the media, but he was also now high on the list for surveillance by the United States government, starting with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, starting with the FBI. Okay, let me try to skip over a couple of things here in the interest of time. Malcolm's ability to organize and mobilize was not limited to any one part of the country. Elijah Muhammad designated Malcolm as his national spokesperson, and along with that as the national minister. This was the first time that these positions had been created within the Nation of Islam. And I've had the privilege of being around brothers who were members of the Nation of Islam at that time. One in particular, a very dear brother, may Allah have mercy on him, by the name of Kenneth Muhammad. He used to live in Raleigh, North Carolina. And Kenneth Muhammad traveled extensively with Malcolm in organizing temples across the United States. And Kenneth Muhammad's testimony about Malcolm was that he didn't see when this man slept, when did he ever go to sleep, was he ever tired from doing what he was doing? Malcolm said in his own words, and Kenneth verified this along with others who were personally traveling around with Malcolm and being involved with him during this time, that when Malcolm, as he said about himself, when he got out of prison, he bought 3 things. He said he bought a watch. And he said that there was no one who was more conscious about time than Malcolm X. No one. That you can just set your body clock, you can set your program and everything else about when Malcolm would show up. They said he was never late for anything. He also bought some glasses. It said that he had ruined his eyes reading at lights out when he was in prison, when that germ of just gaining knowledge had so overtaken him that he would read throughout the night when the lights were out, and he would try to read from a light out in the hallway, so his eyes got bad. So he bought a pair of glasses, and then he bought the ever-present suitcase that his wife Betty said that he kept a packed suitcase at the door all the time because he traveled so much that he did not have the time to for every trip come in and pack and unpack, pack and unpack. So she kept a suitcase packed at the door for him. So when he came in and he's ready to rush her back out, he could just grab and have clean clothes and go about his work. So what I'm describing, what I'm attempting to describe is a person who was a tireless, dedicated worker for what he was committed to at that particular time. And his interest, even in the 1950s, went beyond just the domestic agenda of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm was someone that even as evidence in the late 1950s, had an international perspective of the world. And so we find that in 1956, when Ghana first received this independence. And Malcolm was one of the first voices to champion and to talk about how great this event is and what it meant to the third world, to developing people, and what it meant to black people here in the United States. That whenever another country in Africa was freed from the colonial grip, you could expect Malcolm to try to articulate the importance of this international event and how that related to African American people in this country, African people throughout the diaspora, and what it meant to the imperialists and the colonialists of the time. In 1960, after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Fidel Castro was to address and did address the United Nations General Assembly. When Fidel came to New York, none of the hotels in Manhattan would rent a room to him because it was this communist menace. And the communist scare was very heavy in the United States at this time, so no hotel would even rent someone to the president of a country who was going to address the UN. So Malcolm was able to get the Teresa Hotel in Harlem to actually rent a room or rooms to Fidel Castro and the people who were with him. During this particular time, Malcolm developed a relationship with Fidel Castro. And while Fidel was speaking at the United Nations, Malcolm was invited to official gatherings of the United Nations. This is as a member of the Nation of Islam. And he was meeting African heads of states. He particularly met Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah of the newly freed Ghana. He met Sékou Touré of Guinea. And he met other African heads of states in 1960 while a member of the nation. In 1959, and I'm really going to speed through here in a few things. In 1959, going back 1 year, Elijah Muhammad, the head of the Nation of Islam, wanted to perform Umrah or Hajj. And so when the FBI realized Elijah Muhammad's intent, and Allahu A'lam, but coincidentally, his passport was taken before he could go to make Umrah or Hajj, or to make these arrangements. So Elijah Muhammad sent Malcolm in his stead. And he sent Malcolm, and Malcolm first went to Egypt, where he met not with the then President Nasser, but he met with the Vice President, Anwar Sadat. And he met with the Vice President of Egypt, Sadat. And he got very sick when he was in Egypt. And so his time was cut short in Egypt. So Malcolm was supposed to be the prep guy for Elijah Muhammad's Hajj or Umrah. So he moved on to Jeddah. But it's written, and Malcolm said himself, that he got so sick, or a continuation of the stomach problem that he was having in Egypt, in Cairo, that by the time he got to Jeddah, he was too sick to try to go any further to perform Umrah himself, or to make any arrangements for Elijah. So he ended up coming back to the United States. During this time as well, there were Muslim students in the country. One of these students was a young Sudanese who used to, Malcolm said, he was following Malcolm around in New York. When Malcolm would make presentations outside Harlem Temple number 7, he said that this young Sudanese student would be almost at every event. And at every single event, the student was handing him pamphlets and information about what we call now Sunni Islam, or Orthodox Islam was the language more commonly used at this particular time. He said, wherever he went, and he said that I didn't get angry with him for his persistence, and many of the things that he gave me to read, he said I didn't read them right then, but he was always there. he never gave up on me. When everybody else was saying, astaghfirullah, this mushrik, and wouldn't come near him, he said that this Sudanese, by the name, I think it was Umar Usman was his name, he said he was always around. He was always somewhere close in New York City whenever he went outside of Temple Number 7. And so what we find is that there were Muslims in this country, and there were Muslims outside of this country who had taken an interest in Malcolm and his religious life prior to his leaving the Nation of Islam officially in April of 1964. Now, let me speed through a few other quick things here to try to get to some important points. And that is that in 1963, November 22nd, 1963, the President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was assassinated right here, I'm sure all of you all know that, right here in Dallas, Texas. And when President Kennedy was assassinated, Elijah Muhammad instructed the members of the nation not to comment anything about Kennedy's assassination because he was a beloved by many people. He was a very beloved president. He was young, he was vibrant, he was athletic, his wife was beautiful, and so many different things that attracted the American public to this particular president. So when he was killed, Elijah Muhammad said, well, he's such a beloved president, don't say anything about him. But in the lecture that Malcolm was giving, immediately after the assassination, Malcolm was talking about how the evil that the United States was doing abroad was going to come back and to haunt this nation. And Malcolm had been very upset in January of 1961 when the first president of a free Congo, Patrice Lumumba, was not only assassinated, he was beaten brutally, he was shot, his body was hacked into pieces, and the pieces of his body were dumped into acid. So there were no remains. There were no remains left of this first president of independent Congo, Patrice Lumumba. And so Malcolm had found a kindred spirit in Lumumba. Lumumba was someone who had a vision for Africa bigger than just the country, his own country in the Congo. And so Malcolm was very critical of U.S. foreign policy and what was being done in the name of this country overseas as it related to these developing independent African nations. So he was very upset. And so when Kennedy was assassinated in this country, Malcolm, I guess, couldn't help himself. And so at the end of this presentation about how there's a kind of karmic or boomerang effect that you put something out there, it's going to come back to haunt you if you're not forgiven. You don't ask for forgiveness for it. And in a question and answer session, he said about the murder of Lumumba that it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost, meaning that they had gone out during the day, now it's nighttime, and he said that as an old farm boy, when you see chickens coming home in the evening, it doesn't make you sad, you become glad because your chickens are coming home to roost. As a result of this comment, well, I can say this comment was used by Elijah Muhammad to suspend Malcolm from any mosque activities. He couldn't speak in any mosque, nobody should be able to talk to him. He couldn't say anything publicly in the name of the Nation of Islam. And the suspension was for 90 days. But as the 90 days got closer, Malcolm got the word that this was an indefinite suspension. So on April the 8th, 1964, Malcolm called a press conference announcing that he was officially leaving the Nation of Islam and that he was forming an organization called Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which came a couple of days later, this particular announcement about Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Muslim Mosque Incorporated was for anyone who identified themselves as a Muslim. And so Malcolm was encouraged again by some of the immigrant Muslim brothers and by his sister Ella to perform the Hajj in 1964. But it was a short window in order for him to get everything together with his visa and to get out of here. So the short story is that Malcolm, as the Hajj was paid for by his sister Ella, was able to perform Hajj in April, I think it was April 22nd, 1964. At this press conference on April the 8th, he had said that he was still a Muslim, but at this particular time, he was still saying that he was still following the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, but he just couldn't work within the organization. He said that he thought that Mr. Muhammad had the best plan for black folks. And so at this time, he was not clear about his religious and spiritual direction. He only knew that he could no longer stay within the confines of the Nation of Islam. So when Malcolm decided to perform this pilgrimage and actually made the pilgrimage, it's very historic about how Malcolm, how his perspective on racial relations and religious affairs, particularly the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ being the Khatam Nabiyeen, the seal of all the prophets, and that far couldn't possibly have been Allah. He instantly realized, even before he got to Mecca, by stopping again in Cairo and being there for 2 days just as a tourist and sightseeing, he realized that even before he got to Saudi Arabia, that what he had been professing and teaching for the last 12 years as the national spokesman for Elijah Muhammad, that this was wrong, that this had nothing to do with true Islam. So there's a copy, I actually saw a copy of the handwritten Shahada wrote out and is dated April the 8th, 1964. And it was on the letterhead of the Islamic Foundation of New York, which is now the 96th Street Mosque in New York. So as early as April the 8th, 1964, he hand-wrote the Shahada on this letterhead of this Islamic Center stating that he believed that there was only one God and that Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, peace be upon him, was his apostle, as he put, and his final prophet. So this particular issue of declaration was done before he made the Hajj. So Malcolm made the Hajj and had all of these wonderful experiences. He was traveling all over the place. He came back. When he came back into the States in June, he formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was patterned after the Organization of African Unity that had been formed in 1963, I think by Nkrumah. And this was an attempt to bring together African states for the common interest of uplifting the African continent, the individual states, and the people and the countries themselves. Now, I'm skipping over a lot of things. Malcolm traveled extensively during his last 11 months. This first time he was out of the country, he was gone for 18 weeks. He really traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, throughout the African continent. He met Nasser in Alexandria. One of the things I'd like to mention, though, he went to Nigeria, and at Ibadan University, he was invited by the Nigerian Muslim Student Society to speak there. And he was given the title there of Omo Wali, or the child who has come home. And so now Malcolm is just adding on these honorific titles. And his pre-nation days, he's Detroit Red.
After this particular period, he's Malcolm X, from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X. Now that he made the Hajj in April of '64, he's El Hajj Malik Shabazz. And now that he's visited Nigeria and Ibadan University, now he's given this title that Malcolm said meant a lot to him, figuratively and literally, as the child who has come home for a while. So these different transformations in names he was making at different stages of his life. He had stopovers in Monrovia, Dakar, Morocco, and Algiers. When he came back, he founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity in June of '64. This was an organization that Malcolm established to involve non-Muslims, because within the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, you kind of had Muslims of all stripes within this. You just say that you're a Muslim, and basically you would be a member of Muslim Mosque Incorporated. But now he said that he found that Muslim Mosque Incorporated was too limiting, that he had a vision, a global vision, and that the Muslim Mosque Incorporated was not allowing non-Muslims to get involved in his political vision or political mechanism. So in June of '64, he formed an organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. This was a group that met every week. If you can imagine Malcolm as a person speaking before this group every single week. He had the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, that he had about 3 days of activities that he was responsible for being involved with in this organization. He was constantly being called across the country to speak, and to lay on top of this that the members of the Nation of Islam were attempting to take his life in almost every outing that he was going to. There were incidents like on the freeway in Los Angeles when he came back for the first time, where his car, there was a nation car that kept trying to run him off the road on the freeway in LA. There were times when folks jumped out with guns and he had to flee to get away from these things. When he was in the Cairo Hilton Hotel, because he made a second trip overseas in November of '64, when he was in the Cairo Hilton Hotel, he was poisoned in the restaurant of the Cairo Hilton Hotel. And this is when Malcolm began to say that he realized that the attempt to take his life was bigger than just the Nation of Islam, that he would no longer say that only the Nation of Islam were trying to kill him, because he said that they couldn't put somebody in the kitchen of the Cairo Hilton Hotel, and that many other things that were going on around him could not just be the work of the Nation of Islam, but there was a much bigger conspiracy. Since that time, if you read materials, well-documented materials that have come out about the assassination of Malcolm, you see that there was a little piece of a lot of different law enforcement and organizations and individuals involved in his assassination. You had the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you had the New York City Police Department, you had the actual triggermen from the Nation of Islam. Now, I'm going to jump to this end point about Malcolm's assassination, and I'll be coming to a close here in a second. In February, Malcolm was in February 8th, he was in London, and he stayed in London for 2 days. And he was to come back leave London and go to Paris. And he was speak to a group in Paris. African students had invited him to speak there. But when he landed at the airport in Paris, he was immediately detained, put back on the plane, and sent to London. They would not let him off the plane in French soil. And there were a number of reasons, official reasons that were given. But most folks think that at this juncture in Malcolm's life, that it was clear that he was going to be assassinated. And the French government did not want that quote-unquote PR disaster on their hands with as many nations that they had colonized on the African continent getting their independence, like Algeria and all these other countries, these Francophone states in the African continent. They didn't want to have this problem in explaining why Malcolm was killed in an airport in France or on French soil when this independence movement was so strong on the African continent. So what ended up happening, Malcolm was not allowed to get off he got off the plane, got detained, got put back on the plane, sent to London. From London, Malcolm went to Geneva, Switzerland, to meet and to visit with Sayyid Ramadan, who was the then director of the Islamic Center in Switzerland, in Geneva. And I want to just read just a question and a response in the interest of time, because I don't have time to develop the point. But this is an issue that Malcolm was confronted with from the time that he left the Nation of Islam until the time of his assassination. And so in February 1965, Malcolm stopped to meet with Sayyid Ramadan at this Islamic Center. And Sayyid Ramadan gave him 9 questions and said, Malcolm, when you get a chance, answer these questions for me. And the seventh question, I think it was. Yeah, the seventh question, and just bear with me as I read this quickly. And again, I'm reading this because it showed the difficulty that Muslims at that time had with Malcolm, one of the difficulties that they had with Malcolm. Because if truth be told, no matter how much we talk about loving Malcolm X, when the time when Malcolm was alive, the majority of Muslims in this country would not go anywhere near him, even after he left the Nation of Islam. Even when after he was assassinated in the Audubon Ballroom on February the 21st, 1965, even in death, the Muslims would not go anywhere near, for the most part, for Malcolm X. And so here we are, without understanding the historical context of what's going on during this time, and we say, well, why was Malcolm laying up in a church? Or why was Malcolm laying up for viewing in a funeral home? It was because the Muslims, for whatever reason, would not go anywhere near his body or let him anywhere in our facilities. That's why this happened. His widow, Betty Shabazz, told me herself that it was shameful to her, and it was so hurtful to her that when after Malcolm was assassinated, that the Muslim community, for the most part, stayed away from her, she and her family, like they were lepers. That there was no level of support, there was no level of encouragement. There may have been individual Muslims, but she said that had it not been for white socialists and leftists, she and her family would have starved. Now this is from her mouth to my ear. I'm not telling you something, third hand. I heard this from her own mouth. And so there were issues about Malcolm, and can we embrace him, and is he truly a Muslim? And a lot of this had to do with his uncompromising stand for what is right, what is truth. And saying a word of truth, not trying to be hurtful. Because everyone I've ever talked to who knew him personally talked about what a soft-spoken person he was, how kind he was, how he would go out of his way to do things for people. That the persona on the stage was not the real person that he presented himself to be when he wasn't behind a lectern. But people, as Muslims, we were afraid, can't put it any other way, to get near him because of his uncompromising, Allahu Akbar, but I believe because of his uncompromising stance. And that he was saying things that would upset the U.S. government, about their policy in the Muslim world and their policy throughout the Far East and the Near East and all over the planet. And so one of the chief reasons why so many Muslims, and I've forgotten this from so many people, that was put forward while, we're not sure about Malcolm, was his non-apologetic attention given to the problems of who at that time were the most oppressed people in the United States, the most legally restricted people in the United States, and these were black folks in this country at this time. And so even enlightened Muslims, even Islamic movement Muslims, even Muslims who were reaching out to try to help educate African Muslims in this country at this time, still had this issue. And this is the problem. And this was one of the questions written by Said Ramadan to Malcolm, and Malcolm finished this the night before he was assassinated. He finished writing this on the 20th. He got back in the country on the 20th, and he stayed up until midnight writing this stuff. And his response, and is it true that even after you're breaking away from Elijah Muhammad, you still hold color as a main base and dogma for your drive under the banner of liberation in the United States? How could a man of your spirit, intellect, and worldwide outlook fail to see Islam, its main characteristics? From its earliest days as a message that confirms beyond doubt the ethnological oneness and equality of all races, thus striking at the very root of the monstrosity of racial discrimination. Endless other texts of Qur'an and prophetic sayings to this effect, and nothing would testify to that more than the historic fact that heterogeneous races, nations, and linguistic entities have always mingled peacefully in the homeland. Malcolm's answer was, as a black American, I do feel that my first responsibility is to my 22 million fellow black Americans who suffer the same indignities because of their color as I do. I don't believe my own personal problem is ever solved until the problem is solved for all 22 million of us. Much to my dismay, until now, the Muslim world has seemed to ignore the problem of black Americans, and most Muslims who come here from the Muslim world have concentrated more efforts in trying to convert white Americans than black Americans. There are two groups of Muslims in America. One, those who were born in the Muslim world, migrated here, and were already Muslims when they arrived here. If these total 200,000, they have not succeeded in converting 1,000 Americans to Islam. Two, American-born persons who have converted to Islam are 98% black Americans. Up until now, it has been only the black American that has shown interest in Sunni Islam. If a student of agriculture has sense enough to concentrate his farming efforts in the most fertile area of his farm, I should think that the Muslim world would realize that the most fertile area for Islam in the West is the black American. This in no way implies discrimination or racism, but rather shows that we are intelligent enough to plant the grand seed of Islam where it will grow best. Later on, we can doctor up or fertilize the less fertile areas, but only after our crops are already well planted in the heart and mind of these black Americans who already show great signs of receptivity. This has been a crucial hang-up for the development of, I'll say, black Islam in the United States from the time of Malcolm and Al-Hazmi Shabazz until today. Because I can attest, just from my personal experience, that over the years, when African American or Muslims bring to the attention, or this historically perhaps not as bad today, and it's definitely not in a facility like this, but it has been the case in so many places across the United States that African Americans are looked at as being restrictive in Islam when issues relating to the African American community are put forward. It's like, just like Said Ramadan was saying to Malcolm, you're an intelligent man, Malcolm. You're a smart man. how could you still be talking about African American people and you now entered the fold of this global Islam that recognizes no racial distinctions? And this is the burden that African American Muslims, in my humble position, have had to deal with from the time of Malcolm and perhaps even up to right now. And it is a position that delegitimizes Muslims in identifying that these are areas that as Muslims, all of us, should be concerned about these conditions. For an example, today, as we sit here, this country has, and we all know this, it has the largest rate of incarceration of its own citizens of any country on the planet. Not per capita, I'm talking about body counts. Almost 2.6 million people in prisons across the country. The overwhelming majority of them are people of color, the majority being African Americans, and right behind that is Latinos. This is, and what is going on in this prison industrial complex is a disgrace. It's a sin. It's a crime against humanity. And I assert, and Allah forgive me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the media has conditioned us so much to believe that these people in these prisons are criminals anyway, so there's no need in getting all worked up about them. These are the kinds of issues that Malcolm, on an international level and on a national level, would not allow non-Muslims, activists, and Muslim activists to take off their radar. These are legitimate issues of human rights. They're issues that we should all be concerned about. But oftentimes, if it relates to people of African descent, of Latino descent, it gets taken off the radar, and those who push these issues forward are looked at as if this is something that you shouldn't be talking about. Why are you talking about these issues and you're a Muslim? This is asabiyya, this is nationalism that you're talking about. And so I contend, and Allah knows best, that there are many folks who refuse to embrace Malcolm even in his death. The more they learn about his uncompromising stand for what is truth and what is right. Malcolm is a symbol to a lot of people. He means, and I'm going to end on this note, that he means so many different things to different segments of this country. Because Malcolm said that he saw the developing nations in Africa and Asia at the time, in the 1960s, moving towards socialism and not capitalism as state economic systems, the socialists have embraced Malcolm. And when I first became Muslim in the early 70s, the majority of the books about Malcolm and his speeches and his travels were produced by socialists, by the Socialist Labor Party. If you wanted books about Malcolm, you couldn't get it from the Muslims. You had to get it from the socialists. And so it projected this image that Malcolm would have been a socialist. And then so there have been so many segments of people throughout the U.S. population and the world who take pieces of Malcolm and say that, yes, this is what Malcolm was, and attempt to use him for whatever political or ideological agenda that they may have. And so I pray that we are able, as Muslims, to rise above this kind of thinking, that we will limit what we feel about Malcolm, how we embrace Malcolm, based on whether we are made uncomfortable by what Malcolm says. And I pray that the phenomena of what we are calling Black Islam, or Black American Islam, is a phenomena that will be more than just a conscious for the community here in this country. That we have to do more in trying to develop not just the black folks' Islam, but integrating and identifying the problems and the issues that impact and affect all of us as we move into the balance of the century. Assalamu alaikum.